It won't be long now before UFC 183, Nick Diaz versus Anderson the Spider Silva is upon us. It's coming up at the end of the month. And I'd like to make an informed prediction about what's going to happen. I've probably, one time or another, seen a good portion of these guys' fights. So they're not new to me, of course, but I decided that before I lay down what I think is going to happen for this fight, I would review both careers of Diaz and Silva. So over the last 3 days or so, I went into the UFC fight library and I focused on Diaz and everything that I could pull up from his past fights. And it's not all of them, it's about 20 out of his 36 career MMA fights. Or no, 22 I think. He covers everything that he did in the UFC, one fight for Pride, some fights for Elite XC, his Strike Force fights. I don't know if it's all of his Strike Force, but at least a good portion of them. And 22 of 36 fights is, you know, that's a pretty good chunk. So we're talking almost 2/3 of his fights that I reviewed over the last 3 days. And the other ones, you know, I don't know where exactly to find them. Maybe YouTube has some of them, but I think with the 22 fights I can say enough about Diaz and his career. When we see him come in, well, first of all, I should say that he brings into his career a history with training the martial arts from the time he was a teenager or so, and he has some boxing background and some jiu-jitsu background. He's with Cesar Gracie School, and he also has very, very good cardio, and he's maintained this all the way along. His mom put him in swimming lessons early on, and for what portion of high school that he completed, he was on the swim team, and you know, he's kept that up, swimming, running, and a lot of people know him as the MMA fighter that does triathlons, and so he's got kind of an endless cardio that has really helped him in his career. When he first comes in, I think his first UFC fight, I don't know about, maybe some of his other fights that I missed are pre-UFC, but when he first comes in, he fights Jackson, and looking at his style, I mean, it's all Gracie Jiu-Jitsu basically. He keeps outside of striking distance till he sees an opportunity to close the gap very quickly, take the opponent down, grapple with him. I think he won that fight by armbar, but it was all real classical jiu-jitsu the whole way. Next fight that he comes out for in the UFC is against Lawler, and this time we see a completely different Nick Diaz, and this is the fight that really made an impression on people at first, that like really got his career rolling with some fame and glory, because Lawler had been knocking guys out in the UFC. I mean, quite the striker. And Diaz comes in, and everybody's expecting him to try to take Lawler down and use his jiu-jitsu training, but Diaz instead meets him toe-to-toe with the striking and outstrikes him, knocks him out and wins the fight. And just as upsetting as anything, because nobody expected that. And that fight was actually the first time that we see Nick Diaz taunting an opponent, and it would become one of his signature techniques I think I include it along with his techniques, along with his striking, along with his ground game. He had and he has a very strong psychological game where he gets inside his opponent's head, basically by taunting them and mocking them in the ring, trash talking outside the ring a bit. He definitely has a big ego, but you know, there's cause for having big egos sometimes. But in any case, with the Lawler, we first start seeing him trash talk inside the ring, and it surprises the referee so much because we hadn't seen that in UFC fights. It throws everybody off so much that the ref even tells him, you know, shut up, no talking, which totally isn't a rule. And so, you know, from that fight forward, we see this develop with Diaz, that he is going to be the, you know, the trash talker, not just trash talking, but like really taunting. Every once in a while you catch somehow on the microphones, you'll catch part of what he says, and he might be, you know, grounding and pounding a guy and saying, how do you like that, bitch? Or might be saying, you know, don't be scared, homie, or, you know, stuff like this, like really messing with them, not only with verbal language, but with body language, you know, holding his hands up like he's, you know, not afraid of them, doesn't need to defend himself, or just pacing, like, you know, chasing them around the ring, basically stalking them with his hands at his side, you know, and then sticking his head way out, you know, and making faces at them, go ahead and hit me, kind of a thing. And it really tends to throw his opponents off. I think it ends up playing a big part in his game. He psychologically defeats them as much as he physically defeats them, and it helps him toward the physical defeat. Now with Lawler, we learned that Diaz is a strong puncher. And from then on, we see Diaz the boxer inside the ring, and it might come like toward the, you know, end of a bout. If he's not able to knock somebody out with his boxing, then he might take him to the ground and try submissions. Or if it just happens that they try to take him to the ground, then they got trouble to deal with down there, because he does have very good jiu-jitsu. So moving on from Lawler, it's maybe 6 fights further. He's fighting, I think the name was Nears, and when he fights Nears, to me this is the first time we really see like the way that his boxing develops. At first he's pretty much a hard hitter, kind of, well, at least harder than he would become. In Nears, we really start seeing Diaz using what would become a signature trait with him, which is the peppering of strikes, the peppering of punches, where he's not hitting with a lot of force, but he's hitting very accurately, and he's hitting a lot. I think, in fact, I read somewhere that he has a record for the most strikes either thrown or actually the most strikes to make contact in a single round. We're talking, you know, in the hundreds, maybe 200 or more strikes. But yeah, just peppering his opponents. And a lot of them have, you know, talked about it after fighting him, after losing to him, and saying that, well, you know, the punches don't hurt too much. They wear you down, and he's striking so fast that you don't even have time to breathe. You don't breathe right, you know, and so it exhausts them basically. And then when they're exhausted, they start letting their, you know, they can't guard themselves as well. Then he might lay in some heavy punches and knock them out, or get them on the ground and pound them. And this kind of becomes Nick's signature move. Now, mid-career, he shifts gears, starts messing around with Pride, Elite XC, Strikeforce. I don't know what made him, maybe financial reasons or whatever, that he went to the other organizations. But at some point, he wins. I think it was after his fight with Gomi, where that fight with Gomi, by the way, was I think it's one of the best fights, maybe the best fight for Nick Diaz, in my opinion, because I mean, it's really a fast-paced brawl, and Diaz meets it all the way, and then ends up submitting Gomi with a go-go plata, which is just awesome. I really liked that fight in particular, but I think it might have been after that he got busted for having THC in his system, smoking weed, and so they put him on a 6-month suspension. And then when he came back, I think he fought Nunes, his first fight against Nunes, and I think over the time he started getting cut a lot on his face, and when he fought Nunes, he was getting cut pretty bad. He's getting pretty bad. He's bleeding and all of this, real blood red mask. And so they one of the doctor, whatever, at the end of, I think maybe even round 1, called an end to the fight, and Nick was very upset. Jumped out of the ring, walked out of the arena, flipping everybody off. He was pissed off. So he felt like that fight was stolen from him, I think, and to an extent it was, because he wasn't done fighting, but his wounds were just too much for the doctor to allow to continue. So after that, he goes and he gets plastic surgery, has a bunch of the scar tissue and stuff removed from over his eyes so that he won't be cut open as easy in the future. Comes back into Strikeforce and starts beating everybody. Gets the welterweight title for Strikeforce, the belt, and every opponent they put at him, he lays away. It's not a problem for him. I think he goes through, I don't even know how many fights, half a dozen fights at least, and nobody's beaten him. And then he decides to go back into the UFC. Why? Again, I don't know. I think in his last Strikeforce fight, when he's being interviewed at the end, he says something about wanting to get paid. Maybe he decides for financial reasons to go back in the UFC. Either way, they throw him in with BJ Penn, and in a way, I see them matching him up with BJ Penn as very similar to the way they're matching Silva up with Diaz now, but I'll talk about that later when I actually make my fight prediction. Either case, they put him in with BJ Penn. BJ Penn, also known for his boxing, also very good at jiu-jitsu, and also having just as strong a chin as Diaz. And that's something I didn't even talk about yet, but another thing about Diaz is he just does not get knocked out. I mean, according to his tally sheet or whatever, his stats, he's been knocked out twice, but in the 22 fights that I saw, he didn't get knocked out. He didn't even really come close. He got knocked down 2 or 3 times. But I'd never seen him like on wobbly legs or all this kind of stuff. And never thought he was totally in jeopardy of being like totally knocked out. He has a really strong chin, takes some massive punches, and just like they're nothing, he just walks through them. He's really a very tough guy. When I look at him, to me, he reminds me of tough guys that I went to school with that were, they're not jocks. They didn't fit into necessarily any clique or this kind of thing, Couldn't categorize them easily, but except you just knew that they were very tough and very raw, and that's the way Nick Diaz strikes me as. In fact, both of the Diaz brothers, very, very tough kids. I'm sure they trained each other growing up, the brothers. So anyway, he goes in with BJ Penn, and they both have similar skills, but Diaz has a height on him and he has a reach on him, and he ends up really busting up BJ. Like, you never seen BJ's faces turn into hamburger like that before. And even at the end of the fight, BJ's like, that's enough for me, you know. I think I'm gonna retire now. He lost the fight. They went all the way through, you know, went the distance and all that, but BJ lost by judge's decision, and it was a good decision because he really did get beat. He did get beat, and his face looked totally mangled afterwards. And so then after that fight, I mean, right after the judge's decision and all that, Nick was calling out George St. Pierre, who was in the audience. George St. Pierre, he wants to fight with George, and George was off on he had a injury, and he'd been off for a little bit, but he was the, you know, welterweight champion, and Diaz basically infers that George is lying, that he's not really hurt, that he's just scared to fight. You know, this is the kind of taunting and stuff he does outside of the ring. Inside it gets much worse. But so he's calling out George, but between him and George stands the other contender for that title, who's Carlos Condit. And so before he fights George, he goes to fight Condit, and this is the first time that Nick Diaz has actually fought somebody who is, you know, his same size. I mean, Condit's even a little bit taller, I think, but the same reach and all of this, and Condit has kind of a I don't know if you call it a Muay Thai approach, but he has a real diversity of techniques that he uses. And with his, you know, he's not easy to, like all the other fights that Diaz had, he can put his arm out basically and distance the guy, hold his forehead and keep him, you know, just judge the distance and then pop him. You can't do that with Condit. If he's that close, Condit's able to hit him too. So it's basically a brawl. Their fight is just basically a brawl, and but Condit is his strikes are both harder, you know, both more, you know, more devastating, and he's connecting with more of them than Diaz is. And so you know, long story short, at the end of the 5 rounds, it's the judges that rightly give the decision to Condit. And so Condit goes to fight GSP and loses. And then it's GSP versus Diaz. And GSP versus Diaz, we see a whole different fight. Something entirely different than we've ever seen, which is somebody that can absolutely just dominate and control and ragdoll Nick Diaz. I mean, GSP has the ability to trade punches, to box, to fight on his feet, to strike. When he wants to bring it to the ground, it's like nothing. It's like it seems like almost effortless. He's so good at it. He moves in a lot of double leg takedowns, and once he takes Diaz down, even with all the jiu-jitsu, you know, that Diaz has in his arsenal, GSP just completely dominates him on the ground, just holds him down, You know, does ground and pound, but mostly just, you know, wearing him down. And watching the fight, you know, I really did, watching the fight again, I'd seen it before, but I really did start to appreciate why people criticize GSP as this guy that just, you know, he goes for points. He's not in it necessarily for the brawl. Like Nick Diaz, he's there to fight. And George, I think maybe the third or fourth round, he decided to just fight and box for a little while. But he was getting hurt. He was taking some punishment. So he's like, takes him down and does some more work on the ground, where he totally domineers over Diaz. And so it was a completely different fight. Like, never seen Diaz get treated like that. And you just can appreciate the level of the fighter that George St. Pierre was in comparison. I mean, Nick Diaz is an awesome fighter, like world-class fighter, and GSP is like just out of his league, just way beyond. Diaz had no chance. It was just a humiliation. So yeah, Diaz loses the fight, obviously. You know, they go the distance, but he loses the fight. So that was a couple of years ago. Now Diaz is coming back to fight Silva. Silva, of course, has been off on an injury. And so I'm going to go into the fight library and I'm going to review Silva's career next. But looking at GSP, what are his skills? His skills, like I said at the beginning, he's got the psychological skills that he applies every single time. The only time I didn't see the psychological skills working was against GSP. I mean, GSP was mad like he's never been mad in any other fight. But in the ring, in the octagon, Diaz really didn't have time to fuck around like that with George St. Pierre, because he was getting beat up and he needed to defend himself. So whether or not he'll be able to use that to its full effect on Silva or not, I'll talk about that later. But so he's got that. He's got the psychological tactic like crazy. He's got his unique style of peppering boxing, wearing a guy down, combines it with his awesome cardio, so that a guy better be able to keep up that pace. And you know, for 5 rounds, a hard pressing pace of Nick Diaz. His leg work is kind of sloppy, like not his footwork per se, not his footwork, but like his kicks I'm talking about. The only time I start seeing Diaz really employ kicks is when he's messing around or toward the end of a fight. If nothing else is working, he might try some kicks, but his kicks look kind of weak, kind of sloppy, a little bit telegraphed and stuff. And so I don't think they're much danger to anybody, you know, unless the guy was really caught off guard. But his hands are very accurate, very fast, and not a lot of power, but it's the accumulative thing. And then when he's taken to the ground, most of the time he's pretty good with being able to get to submissions if he can. With GSP it didn't work, but he was just totally overstrength and, you know, basically outclassed, I think, in terms of martial arts. So that is my review of and he's got the solid chin. He's not going down. So that's my review of Nick Diaz's career. And now I'm going to go and watch Silva's stuff, and I'll get back with a review of Silva's career next. And then after that, I'll make my prediction.